It's a rare pleasure for me to have the chance to introduce to you our speaker for this evening, Dinaw Mengestu, and his new novel, All Our Names. Dinaw is an award-winning author and a MacArthur Fellow, which is the signal that you're officially a genius. All Our Names is the story of Isaac and Helen, and what a beautiful, haunting story it is. That's all I'm going to say. Ladies and gentlemen, Dinaw Mengestu.
Short but sweet, which are always the best introductions. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming out this evening, and to the staff at Politics Prose, who have been incredible, wonderful supporters for 3 books, and hopefully more to come in the future. But really, this was one of the great bookstores in this country, and it's such a pleasure and honor to be here and to read in this capacity. So, but before going into a reading of All Our Names, I thought maybe this would be a good time to try to contextualize this novel, since D.C. is also such a formative place in my imagination and in my career as a writer. My first novel began, The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears, began while I was walking down a street in Washington, D.C., and I saw a man behind the counter of a little grocery store near Adams Morgan. And right away I had this voice of an older and slightly melancholic immigrant shopkeeper who had lost everything and was now settled into the United States. And that first novel in many ways started off this book as well. It's the first of what I now think of as 3 very closely related stories. All 3 stories I've been trying to work their way through this problem of what happens when you have lost your home and you're forced to reconstruct yourself. And oftentimes we tend to think of that as being an immigrant narrative, which is always a category that I find very problematic, because that seems to somehow marginalize that particular experience and put it into the category of only people who have lost their homes or have had to flee, when in fact I think all of us are called upon to do exactly those same things. We all lose things that we love. We all lose people that we love. And every time in the face of those losses, we have to rebuild ourselves. We have to constitute another version of ourselves in order to continue on with our lives. So my first 2 novels were born very much out of this idea of rupture, right? You lose your home, you lose the things that you love, and now you're forced to recreate yourself again in a foreign country, always here in the United States. And this novel, while it continues those themes, had its origin, I think, in something initially a little bit more optimistic. So it's the idea that rather than what happens after that rupture, what happens after the displacement, I was concerned with what happens when things come together as a result of that. Everyone knows the great Chinua Achebe novel, Things Fall Apart. This is almost the opposite of that. It's things come together when they're not supposed to. So in some ways, the character in this novel, the first narrator in this novel, Isaac, he comes to America having lost his home. But what I was interested in, as much as I was interested in that loss of a country and the sort of political violence that surrounds it, was also very much how his narrative begins to mirror and reflect very much on a very uniquely American narrative. So we oftentimes tend to think of the histories of nations as being radically distinct from one another, especially when they occur in places that we consider far away. So the narratives of lives in Africa or Asia can seem like they exist in an entirely different sphere than the lives here in America. But it turns out when you actually bring these stories together onto a very intimate personal plane, you can begin to see how they actually reflect one another, how these little narrative devices begin to carry echoes across generations and across time periods. And so this novel began with this idea that there was a great moment of hope and optimism in Africa following the end of the colonial era. And I wanted very much to write out of that. And once I began to think about that, I began to realize, there's a lot of similarities here, right? So 1962, you have the independence of Uganda. 1963, you have the Kenyan independence. 1963, you also have the March on Washington here in Washington, D.C. And you have the civil rights movement really gaining its ground. And both movements reflect a sort of desire for independence, for liberties that have been denied and that might finally be achieved. And at the same time, you have those moments. You also have the sort of demise that follows, the sort of frustration and the disappointment that accompanies those narratives. So right afterwards, you have 1968, you have the death of Martin Luther King and the assassination of Robert Kennedy. You also have the rise of totalitarian states and tyrants in Africa. And I began to think, rather than try to think of these narratives as being somehow noble, that if you actually place them side by side, if you allow characters to exist in a much closer space, then you can actually begin to see our stories as inevitably intertwined, as so distinctly parallel that we can no longer think of each other as somehow radically different, as a version of the other, but that in fact we recreate and we replay our lives across generations, across countries, and across nationalities. So as much as possible, the story was an attempt to kind of discard that idea that there is such a thing as an immigrant narrative, to say that all we really have are stories of people who are oftentimes lost and are struggling to build themselves back up, and they do so in the context not only of the people that they love, but also of the countries that they exist in and the times that have created them. So for this evening, I'm going to read two different sections, one longer than the other. But the first narrator that I'm going to read from is a woman named Helen, who is the other narrator in this novel. And Helen is a social worker in a small town in the Midwest in the early 1970s. And Helen is seemingly a strange voice for me to write out of, because she's a white American woman in the United States at a time before I was born. But at the same time, her voice felt incredibly intimate to me, of someone who I felt like I knew right away. And also, Helen for me was a chance to write from a different point of view. Oftentimes we think of the immigrant narrative as the voice of somebody who comes to this country or comes to another country, and what happens to that person. I thought it would also be interesting to write about the people on the other side of that. What happens to the people who are here, who are watching others come into their country, and how do they accept them and how do they react to them? And so Helen became my voice. She became my aperture into seeing the world through those eyes. And so Helen takes on this newcomer named Isaac, who comes to the U.S., and she is supposed to be his chaperone through this small town in America. And eventually they fall in love and they begin to construct a relationship together. So this is their story. I'm just giving my friend a cue that he has a seat for him if he wants. We've known each other since high school, so. Helen. I knew my time with Isaac was temporary. His visa granted him 1 year, and we never discussed the possibility of extending it. I did, despite my best efforts to stay grounded, sometimes imagine that one day we'd drive together to City Hall, nicely dressed, carrying simple silver bands picked up from the town's largest general store in our pockets, so that we could declare our marriage in front of a judge, in the hope that by doing so we would be able to make something permanent. A shared life which, as the saying goes, no man or woman could tear asunder. I imagined us living on a large farm, far away from any town and family, with only chickens and acres of corn for company. How would you feel about living on a farm? I asked Isaac. That depends, he said. Are you there with me? Maybe if you were good, I'd come visit you on the weekends, I said. When it came to more domestic fantasies, however, we fell apart. The distance between what we had and what we wanted was too obvious if we dreamed close to home. I remember taking him to the post office once so he could mail a letter to his mother. While we stood in line to buy stamps, I asked him what her name was. He looked up as if he no longer knew the answer to that question, or had lost the right to answer it. Her name doesn't matter, he said. Everyone only calls her Imaye. When we reached the teller, Isaac handed me the envelope. He was shy speaking in front of strangers, so I was the one who asked how many stamps were needed to mail the letter. While we waited, I tried to pronounce her name the same we had. I said out loud, Imaya, Imayu. Not even close, he said. He pronounced it once more so I could hear how far off I was, and finally, after failing 2 more times, I laughed and said, Forget it. When we meet, I'll just call her Mother. He became silent. What I had said bothered him. I didn't know him well enough yet to understand why, but I felt the distance expanding between us. We paid for the stamps and left the post office, and it wasn't until we were alone in the car that he told me what he was thinking. It doesn't do us any good to talk about things that will never happen, he said. I promised myself I would never ask him about his family again, and by and large I stayed true to that. I thought as well, however, that if we couldn't have a future, I could at least try to make the most of our present. We were running out of errands and chores to complete, and it was time, I told him, we moved on to something else. We're going to have to find other things to do, I said, except go to the grocery store. What would you like? I thought of all the possible options open to us. I thought of what normal couples did. They went to the movies, dinner, They invited friends over on the weekend. They had beach vacations. I knew we couldn't get away with any of that, so I told Isaac, I don't know, but I'll come up with something. I decided over breakfast with my mother that certain risks had to be taken if Isaac and I were going to have any sort of life together. I didn't make this decision lightly. She asked me that morning while setting the table, "Do you have a new friend, Helen?" She was dependent on gentle phrasing. That was the register we carried all our conversations in. "Would you like to help me with the shopping this weekend, Helen? Do you think it's time we change the curtains in the living room, Helen?" I always responded in kind. "No one that I know of," I said, but I promised to keep looking. The last time she had asked that question was shortly after I began working with David. I spoke of him often around the house, and if there's anyone I spent the weekends and evenings with, it was him. She asked me repeatedly if David was a special friend, a hope abruptly relinquished when she met him. Telling her about Isaac wouldn't have brought her any comfort. David was the only one who had suspected, and even he was quietly alarmed by the suggestion. When we were alone in his office, he had said, "I hope you know what you're doing with your Dickens." It wasn't a reproach. I had the feeling he found saying those words embarrassing, but I nodded and tried to make it all seem light-hearted. "Of course I know," I said. "I'm a professional at this." We weren't divided like the South and had nothing to do with any of the large cities in the North. We were exactly what geography had made us, middle of the road. Never bitterly segregated, but with lines dividing black from white all over town, whether in neighborhood, churches, schools, or parks. We lived semi-peacefully apart, like a married couple in separate wings of a large house. That was the image I had in mind during breakfast when I decided something different had to be done. Change. It seemed to be everywhere except Laurel. I set my sights low. Incremental progress was my philosophy. Isaac and I didn't have to be heroes. There had been enough of those already. In many ways, I reasoned, Isaac and I had already picked up the fight. We just hadn't known that's what we were doing. I made a list of all the places we had gone to in the 3 months since we'd met. The grocery store, the mall, post office, bank, Goodwill. I thought of them while sitting at my desk and tried to remember if any obvious signs of affection had passed between us. I came up with a crude value system to measure each trip by. 1. Shopping for food. After sex and children, what could be more intimate in America than choosing what kind of meat to cook? The grocery store was the first place in our town that I knew for certain we had conquered. We went once, sometimes twice a week. We laughed in the aisles, took turns pushing the carts. I gave Isaac cooking lessons at the meat counter. Those were all important victories. 2. The post office. I had to admit that it had been a terrible loss. And because it was a government office, I felt I had to weigh the defeat a bit more. One post office defeat was the equivalent of 2 grocery store victories. Mail was dangerous, personal letters especially. They pointed to great distances and old, mysterious lives I knew nothing about. There were tellers instead of clerks, forms that had to be filled. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to win in a place like that. 3. Anything else that was related to shopping. Furniture, plates, cutlery. We had chosen all that together, right under the skeptical eye of the clerks. Had Isaac and I touched each other once, I would have said we dealt an important blow against segregation. But I had to be honest. I knew we had never touched except by accident, so I had to temper the victory with the knowledge that we could have done better. What I needed next were new targets. The first one that came to mind was the most obvious, and I couldn't believe I hadn't thought of it before. A week after our defeat at the post office, I called Isaac from my office and said I wanted to take him out to lunch. To lunch? Yes, I said, for lunch. I'm tired of eating at my desk alone. I chose the same diner my father had gone to every morning, and where as a child I joined him on Saturday afternoons. It was the only place in Laurel that I associated exclusively with him. I had been going there for years on my own and with friends and co-workers, but those other occasions were mere intrusions on the central event. A semi-regular father-daughter lunch that had lasted for 2 years, and that ended in one of those booths with my father promising to visit every week once he moved out. A month went by before I saw him again. I stopped worrying and then caring with more time if he returned. Gradually, my memories of him were distilled into a single, fluid image of a man confined to a booth or counter with thick sideburns and occasionally a soft mustache that moved when he spoke, which wasn't often. The diner was never officially segregated, but I couldn't remember anyone who wasn't white eating there. In this case, it was etiquette, and not a sign that served as the cover for our division. Before I left to pick up Isaac, I wrote down on a piece of paper in case I forgot it later, "We have every right to be here." We arrived shortly after noon, when I knew the restaurant would be crowded. Isaac said he could meet me there, but I insisted on picking him up so everyone could see us walk in together. The lunch counter was already full. Of the half-dozen men sitting there, I knew 3 by name, and the others were familiar. Bill, whose chest and forearms were known throughout Laurel for the strong, black hair that sprouted from them, was leaning over the counter, smiling half-heartedly at everyone who came and left. My father used to tell me to be careful with my food when Bill stood over us. "He sheds," he told me, "like a dog." In the scripted version that had played in my head during the 5-minute drive from Isaac's apartment to the restaurant, the entire diner fell silent as soon as we entered. All eyes turned towards us and we ignored them. We didn't hold hands. That would have been too provocative. But we did pause to look at each other with what I thought of as an abundance of affection. In the version we lived, no one stopped talking. Bill saw me as soon as I walked in and pointed to a table in the middle of the diner. Isaac followed me, but I was so focused on making it to the table that I never stopped to notice if anyone was staring at him. We took our seats. When I picked up my menu as a cover so I could look around the room, I realized no one had noticed yet how remarkable we were. Isaac saw my gaze wandering. "Why are we here?" he asked me. I looked around the room again. I thought I saw Bill and 2 of the men at the counter staring in our general direction. No particular reason. I just wanted to get out. I asked Isaac what he had done all day. "I was at the library," he said. He described the book on contemporary American architecture he had been reading. I told him twice that it sounded very fascinating. "Fascinating," I said, "what they can build these days." Chit-chat. Simple conversation. When Isaac put his hand on the table, I took his pinky and index finger in mine. I held them for 2, maybe 3 seconds while looking at the menu. I used a strand of loose hair as an excuse to let go. Our waitress came and took our order. I ordered the fried chicken. Isaac pointed to the Denver omelet and let me order for him. After our waitress left, I turned my attention back to the counter. I wanted to tell Isaac what my father had said about Bill, but he was no longer there. And with him gone, the men at the counter stopped pretending they weren't staring at us. I tried to ignore them, but then our waitress came back empty-handed, and I felt certain that if I looked over again at them, I'd see them smiling. She was young, fresh out of high school. Had I been young, I would have known who she was. She had a kind, round face and wore her dark brown hair in a bun. She leaned over and whispered to us, "Bill wants to know if you would like to take your food with you." She was doing her best to be kind. Isaac understood immediately what was happening, and in the same breath knew how to respond. Before I could answer, he told her, "No, we would rather eat here." Polite yet determined. She nodded her head. She had no idea what else she could do. Isaac pursed his lips and waited until she had turned to the kitchen before turning his attention to me. "Do you come here frequently?" he asked me. I nodded yes, and then changed my mind and said, "No, not really." "Which one is it?" "I used to come here when I was younger," I said, "but I don't that often anymore." It was true. The diner was a few blocks away from my office, but I went there once a month at most. "We should go," I said. Isaac hadn't stopped staring at me since the waitress left. I was tempted to confess my reasons for bringing him, but I realized I didn't have to. The best intentions didn't change what was obvious. I should have known better. "I'm not going to run," he said. "I'm going to eat my lunch." And briefly I felt bold again. I saw myself adding this lunch to my column of victories once I returned to the office. If we made it through this, then perhaps there was nothing in the world that we couldn't conquer, from post offices to movie theaters and the all-too-perilous family dinner at home. I was imagining what my mother would say if Isaac were to show up one Sunday evening when his lunch arrived. The same waitress brought it, although this time she didn't look at either of us. Her embarrassment was evident. Isaac's omelet was on a stack of thin paper plates barely large enough to hold the food. A plastic fork and knife had been wrapped in a napkin and placed on top, a strangely delicate touch that she must have been responsible for. He unwrapped the knife and fork and placed the palm-sized napkin on his lap. "Do you mind if I start? I hate my eggs when they're cold," he said. He spoke so calmly I assumed he was joking, and I suppose to some degree he was. I tried to laugh. "Ha ha!" But then he cut his omelet into 7 pieces before taking the first bite. He chewed slowly. With every bite I was reminded that we were no longer, if ever, on the same side. He had finished his omelet by the time my order arrived on the standard cream-colored plates used for everyone other than Isaac. The waitress tried to walk away quickly, but I grabbed her wrist and told her I wanted to cancel my order. "Tell Bill that I don't want to eat here," I said. The poor child. She was struggling not to cry. We didn't make it any easier on her. "Leave the plate," Isaac said to her. "We're going to stay and eat it." She hurried back to the kitchen. I stared at the plate of chicken and mashed potatoes and blinked twice, childishly hoping I could make it vanish. "Please," I said to him. "Let's leave now." He shook his head no. "Not until we both finish our lunch," he said. "That's what you wanted, isn't it?" If that was his way of settling the score, then I thought I could play along just as well. For the next 10 minutes, I slowly took my food apart. With my first half-hearted stab into the chicken, all the momentum was gone. There was nothing we could change. I felt a regression back to my mother's kitchen table, where I had spent many nights and afternoons laboring to finish a meal that my father had never shown up for, and that my mother had refused. I had always known there was something cruel in her insistence that I eat every bite on my plate, while my father's food grew cold next to me. She needed a victim besides herself, and when I finally looked up at Isaac after a few minutes and saw him smiling at me, I knew there was something slightly cruel lurking in his gaze. I was too busy creating a new story to linger on that thought. In this story, Isaac and I were still heroes. The fact that we chose to sit there and linger when every part of me wanted to run was proof of the sacrifices we were willing to make. When we left the restaurant and were back in the car, he said to me, "Now you know. This is how they break you. Slowly. In pieces." And this next section is very, very brief, but this is told from Isaac's point of view. And one of the challenges about this novel is trying to explain the narrative perspectives. But so without giving away too much, this is from the Isaac story, but being told inside of Africa at the start of this possible revolution that's trying to happen, that these men are trying to get off the ground. And so they've gone to a house outside of the capital, outside of Kampala on the outskirts, where they're waiting for these men who have arrived to assume their roles as revolutionary leaders. Isaac and I were half asleep on the chairs by the time we were allowed to go back into the house. By then, the girls and the house guards had gone off to the servants' quarters. The cicada lights had gone off, as had all the lights in the city. It was 2 weeks since the government had started cutting off the streetlights after midnight, but I never noticed until then how complete the blackness was. Looking out at the capital from our secluded corner reminded me of a story my father had told me about a city that disappeared each night once the last inhabitant fell asleep. He was good at telling stories. Not great, like my uncles and grandfathers, who reveled in the theatrics. Compared to them, his story was a solemn occasion, delivered in a calm, measured voice that nonetheless left a lasting impression on anyone who was listening. He told me that story about the city that disappeared at night shortly after I developed a sudden, irrational fear of the dark. I must have been 10 or 11 at the time, old enough to have known better than to be afraid of something so common and simple as the end of the day, and well past the age of bedtime stories. But for the first few nights of my terror, my father indulged me. He told me one night about countries thousands of miles to the north where months went by without the sun setting, hoping I would find comfort in knowing that the world didn't end simply because the lights went out in our village. According to my father, the city in this story was once a real place. "I'm not inventing this for you," he said. "Everything I tell you is true." I believed him in that semi-conscious way that children have of dismissing reality and the hope of finding something better. For hundreds of years, my father said, this city existed as long as one person dreamed of it each night. In the beginning, everyone kept some part of the city alive in their dreams. People dreamed of their garden, the flowers they had planted that they hoped would bloom in the spring, or the onions that were still not ripe enough to eat. They dreamed of their neighbor's house, which in most cases they believed was nicer than their own, or the streets they walked to work on every day. Or if they didn't have a job, then of the cafe where they spent hours drinking tea. It didn't matter what they dreamed of as long as they kept one image alive for themselves, and in many cases they would pass that image on to their children who would inherit their house, or attend the same school, or work in the same office. After many years, though, people grew tired of having to dream the same image night after night. They complained. They bickered and fought amongst themselves about whether they shouldn't abandon the city altogether. They held meetings. Each time more people refused to carry the burden of keeping the city alive in their dreams. Let someone else dream of my street, my house, the park, the intersection where traffic is terrible because all the roads lead one way, they said. And for a time there were enough people willing to take on the extra responsibility. There was always someone who said, okay, I will take that dream and make it my own. There were heroic men and women who went to sleep each night when the sun set so they could have enough time to dream of entire neighborhoods, even those they had rarely, if ever, set foot in, because no one else would do so. Eventually, though, even those men and women grew tired of having to carry all the extra parts of the city on their backs while their friends and neighbors walked around carefree. They also wanted other dreams, and one by one they claimed their independence. They said, I'm tired. Before I die, I want to see something new when I sleep. Then the day came when no one wanted to dream of the city anymore. On that day, a young man who few people knew and no one trusted went to all the radio stations and shouted from the center of the city that he alone would take on the burden of keeping the world alive each night. Don't worry, he said. I'll dream of everything for you. I know every corner of the city by heart. Close your eyes at night and know that you are free. From then on, everyone in the city believed they were free to dream about foreign lands, countries they had read about or that had never existed, the lovers they hadn't met yet, the better husbands or wives they wished they had, the bigger houses they wanted to live in someday. The people gave that young man their lives without knowing it. They had given him all the power he wanted, and even though they didn't know it, they had made him their king. Weeks, months, and then years went by. People dreamed of living on the moon and the sun. They dreamed of castles built on clouds, of children who never cried, and while they dreamed, each night their king erased a part of the city. A park disappeared in the middle of the night. A hill that had the best view over the city vanished. Streets and then homes were erased before dawn. Soon the people who complained about the changes went missing. One morning everyone woke to find all the radio stations and libraries gone. A secret meeting was held that afternoon, and it was agreed that the city should go back to the way it had been before. But by then no one could remember what the city had looked like. Buildings had been removed. Street names were changed. The man who ran the grocery store on the busy intersection had vanished. There was another problem as well. When asked to describe what the city looked like now, no one could say for certain if Avenue Marcel and Independence Boulevard still intersected. If the French cafe owned by Mr. Scipion had closed or merely moved to a different corner. It was years since anyone had looked at the city closely, at first because they were free to forget it, and later because they were embarrassed and then too afraid to see what they had let it become. Those who tried to dream of the city again could see only their house or their street as it looked years ago, but that wasn't dreaming. It was only remembering. And a world where seeing was power and nostalgia meant nothing. I thought of telling Isaac that story, but I didn't know how to explain it to him without sounding foolish. The president cut the lights at night, he might have said. So what? He did it because it made it harder to attack. And though that was the obvious reason, I would have wanted to argue that there was something else far worse happening. The city disappeared at night. And yes, the president wanted to protect his power, and what better way to do so than to make an entire population feel that just like that, with the flip of a switch, they and the world they knew, from the beds they slept on to the dirt roads in front of their houses, could vanish. I'll stop there.
Please use the mics. Thanks.
Yes, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer, have a conversation, as long as you use the mics. There always has to be someone who takes the first leap. Please. I feel the same way about myself too. So we're in common territory.
So I know nothing about you. We're reading your book in our book group. What's your background coming to America?
I came to America when I was 2 years old. I was born in Ethiopia, and then came when I was 2.5, and then raised in Peoria, Illinois, and then the suburbs of Chicago. Then went to college here at Georgetown. Then went to I don't know where to stop at that point. So I mean, I that's one of the interesting things also about the sort of the construct of the idea of my voice as being the voice of an immigrant. I am, of course, an immigrant, but I'm also very deeply American. I'm raised here since my whole childhood, and have had to sort of actually reconstruct my identity as an Ethiopian by going back and by building on it, by writing about it. And so, if anything, my books are very much an attempt to try to merge the sort of hybrid sense of who and what I am, and it's something that I think has happened across the course of this country's history. Right, there's always been the sort of new wave of people who come and then have to sort of expand the definition of what it means to be American. So, Italian Americans came in for a long time; they were just sort of seen as like the other. They were the strangers, the newcomers, and then eventually, now you think of them as also just part of the sort of American fabric. The same thing with Hispanic Americans, Chinese Americans. So we are always constantly enlarging this sort of expansive possibilities of what we mean by to be American. It's one of the few countries in the world that I think of as many countries allow for that possibility. America is inherently obliged to that possibility. So I, my background is both. I feel like I can say that I'm fully Ethiopian and fully American at the same time, and neither one of those identities stand in opposition to one another. We tend to think that somehow you choose one because that's what you have to do for some arbitrary, unknown reason. I've never understood why you have to be one thing or another. That seems like a very silly way to think about your world. Like you have to be only happy or sad all day long, or the only thing you have to be is alive or dead. Really, those are the only times life is really black and white. Most of the other spaces in our lives are occupied by a very muddled, complex background. And so I'm a greater fan for complexity than I am for any singular definition of what it means to be who I am or who you are. So, yeah. Yes.
There was an article a few days ago in the New York Times titled "The Apartheid of Children's Literature" by Christopher Myers.
Yeah.
In 2013, there were 3,200 books published in the U.S.
Yeah.
And only 93 of them are about blacks.
Yeah.
And what's your take on that? And what like minority communities, like Ethiopian American communities, could do to tackle that?
Yeah.
You know, this is a big dilemma.
It's a huge problem. I would say huge. I mean, I would say it's a huge problem in children's book and across a sort of literary landscape. And the problems are twofold, right? There's still like a large structural problem in the way we educate people in America, right? So there's still a reason why if you're poor, you're less likely to move up the socioeconomic ladder. You're less likely to sort of be a part of a literary culture and tradition, right? So we fail that way structurally, definitely. And that's really the only way to sort of resolve that. And some of that has to come definitely from the sort of like larger powers of larger institutional powers of our country, from the way we decide to spend and fund and educate our children. And then also, I tend to think our publishers bear a certain responsibility to that. Like my life is made up of publishings. I go to a large literary event and there could be 1,000 people there. 10 maybe will be. I mean, it looks like the craziest, most segregated, divided part of the world possible. You're like, how is this possible? These are the heads of every publishing house in this country. And such a small fraction of people of any color are represented in there. So it's still very much divided that way. And at the same time, there's a dynamic there, right? You can't just sort of look up and say, well, why aren't they doing more? The other part of it has to also come from within every community possible. There has to sort of be an emphasis on the value of of literature, on the value of sort of writing. And the honest thing is, no one's going to tell your story, my story, except for the people inside of your community, right? So to wait for somebody else to grant you that right or authority is a futile game. That authority has to sort of be assumed and taken and fought for, the same way that pretty much every sort of right in this country has sort of been fought for. You want the right to sort of vote, people were sort of like demanded and took that because it was theirs. The same thing goes sort of true for the right to tell your story. And in the absence of not having those narratives, it's not only sort of the children in those communities who miss out on having their lives reflected, but the children outside of those communities as well, right? Like, we read because it enlarges our sense of possibility, our sense of expansion, right? So if children are only reading about children that look like them, the world looks really, really small to them. It looks like a very homogenous, monocultural place to be, and that's a very dull way to exist. So I think, on the other side, you think, well, our children, our adults, we all benefit by having a greater range and access to narratives. There is this slightly daft sentiment that says, people only like to sort of read the things that are familiar to them, and there's some truth to that. When I was getting ready to try to publish my first novel, a friend who was an editor at a large publishing house said, the problem with this story is that really no one wants to read, and this was somebody who was telling me this not in confidence, right? Like, as your friend, I will tell you that you are going to have a hard time as a career as a novelist if you keep writing about these people. And he wasn't being prejudiced or racist. He's not. This was just a very honest, like, market value statement. Like, and one way to also flip that question is because people of color aren't buying books enough, which is true. Like, you increase the percentage of people of color who buy books, you will have a greater demand for people to market those books. It works both ways. You can't only think of it as a one-sided conversation. And at the same time, the other half of that is that his idea of why people read was also kind of failed, right? There's a failure of imagination on his part to think that somehow our audiences are only geared towards reading about lives that reflect and mirror their own. And so I think every time there are other voices, like you look at somebody like Junot Diaz or Chimamanda Chiji, and you see the fact that readers are not reading because of someone's ethnicity or background, but because they want to step into other lives, because they love language, because they want more stories. And it's important to remember that too. So.
This is more of a mechanical question. But I noticed, at least in the two passages that you read from, one was sort of this. It was specific to a time and a place, and then the other one had this more of a, like, this storytelling expansiveness that was of all time. And is that something that, can you sort of expand on that as far as why or I think it's amazingly effective, and how did you come about that?
That's one of the only passages in the novel that actually has a scene like that. That's in fact really the only place that has a deliberate and then there's echoes of Calvino's Invisible Cities that are very much tied into that particular passage that I was thinking of. But most of the novel does oscillate back and forth between the sort of setting of Laurel, a town in the Midwest, and Kampala. But even then, both landscapes are still slightly decontextualized. Like, I never actually say what state Laurel is. I just located in the Midwest in a small college town. I have an idea of what that state would be, but I didn't want to kind of be like, we're now on the Ohio-Missouri border, because that didn't seem that relevant to me. And the same way that the story takes place in Kampala, the characters really quickly stop calling it Kampala. They start calling it the capital, because for them, it's more about the idea of the place that they're trying to absorb, right? They go to the city because they want to absorb the sort of moment of political and intellectual freedom that's happening there, and that's why they're there. They want to be able to assume and take this place over for themselves, rather than come to it with a set of preconceived ideas. And so the novel does, even though both stories are very much grounded in those places, there is a way in which it is also slightly isolated from the reality of those places to some degree, right? Like, you can walk your way through the city, definitely in both sections, but it is very much an imagined version of both spaces. Like, this town Laurel is my construction. This version of Kampala is very much my construction. The time period has some accurate historical references, but really I wanted to assert that this is fiction to some degree as well, and I wanted my characters to live in the cities that they needed to live in, rather than try to live in, the sort of version of like 1971 Kampala, which is interesting, but not what I was really, not my intent. My intent was to create a place that was emblematic of an experience and of a time.
Yeah, but even in sort of in the language of, I mean, what was Isaac was talking about, it sounded he was using these just more, I don't know how to describe it, but larger than
Definitely.
the place itself, the time itself. So
that part is very much rooted in also like in a very kind of oral fable-like tradition, right?
Okay.
So he wants to, and it's also a way for him to sort of manage. There's something very particular that's happening to the city at this time, right? The city is undergoing this sort of drastic political crisis, and one way of trying to understand that, the immediacy of that crisis is to use stories, right? Is to use narratives that are timeless to some degree. So you can sort of like, you can look at the landscape and realize something awful is happening, and sometimes you're afraid to acknowledge the awfulness of what's happening to you. So you use narrative, you use fables, you use myths to tell you how those things are happening.
Nice.
Dinaw, it's a pleasure to see you again and to hear you read again. Congratulations on your third novel. My questions have to do with, it's actually a very good dovetail to the last question. You mentioned this idea of, kind of combining narratives, creating one narrative in which all the characters can eventually connect through. So as I heard you read, without giving too much away, because I haven't read the book, does that happen? Because my sense is there are two narratives going, and do they ever come together, or are there glimpses and moments and they connect and then they disconnect really quickly, or how is that? That's the first question.
How does that happen without giving away the whole story?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I can say that I'm known for writing incredibly funny, happy books. This is only funny if you know that I'm known for doing the exact opposite. I would say that there are, in my idea, the characters always come together even when they fall apart. Things don't have to sort of endure for forever in order to have been touched by one another, and that to me is the more interesting point, is the way characters actually are impacted and they reside as one another, whether or not they are able to stay together, whether or not they lose one another. This book is very much driven by this idea that sort of, without sounding too hokey or sentimental, that when you love someone and to be loved in return leaves a lasting impression that is indelible. Those are the sort of only indelible marks that we have, that we carry with us, that are our moments of sort of grace in our lives. Those are the things that kind of, that permeate us, and that we can pass on, and that endure. So that happens for all the characters in this novel. They may not always be able to continue to share that love with one another, but they are all graced by it.
Can't wait. My second little small question has to do with this last piece of magical realism and storytelling. And I've heard you speak elsewhere saying how important it is to ground the experience in an actual context, especially for African stories, because, it all seems one big blur. And so how are you managing that then?
That's one of the things where you contradict yourself. I have said that, and it is true in this characters. I mean, I would say the characters are deeply grounded in the context of this story. It's less about trying to sort of match the parallels between what happens to the characters in this story with what happens to the sort of like political history of Uganda in this case. I am fairly accurate, so if you can sort of like think about what's happening 1970, 1971 in Uganda, you can see that these things are deliberately echoing, but I don't actually say, here's Obote and here's Amin, and these are the sort of political threats happening. And also one of the things I was doing in this novel is like some of the things are based on experiences that I've had as a journalist that cover a wide range of narratives in Africa. So there's a town here that really echoes a village that I knew in Eastern Congo, that is obviously not located in Eastern Congo in the story, that is very much built, like in my mind and in the story, around the details of this place. So it does have a very concrete, factual reality and a tactile specificity for the reader, I hope. But it's not in Uganda, of course, but that's only I know that, and now you guys know that as well. But
do you speak, read, and write Amharic? And if so, would you one day write a book in Amharic or any other Ethiopian language?
I wish I did. It was about the extent of my Amaranya. No, I'm joking. That's not true. I don't. I can understand a decent amount, but unfortunately, I cannot speak it more fluently or or write it. And it takes me to have the capacity to write in a language is something that oftentimes takes a lifetime to sort of really do. And it takes me 4 to 5 years to write in English one book. So I think even if I could learn Amharic overnight, it would be a really hard challenge to figure out how to actually write a novel in it. What I'd love to see are my books translated into Amharic. So any translators out there?
I think I'd read a piece a year or two ago that you were in Paris, and I thought it suggested you were writing a book with a European setting. There's a question, is that true? And then I thought the first novel was fantastic, and I've been in Washington a long time, and everything felt so real and terrific. Any chance of another Washington setting in a book?
I was in Paris, and this entire novel was written in Paris, which is also why it was so much easier to write about the Midwest. And it was very... one of the things about writing this novel is also writing this novel while somebody mentioned this in a review, so I thought of it now. I was writing this novel while Obama was beginning his campaign for president, and that somehow seems like it worked its way definitely into the back of my imagination at some point in time, because I knew that also I was writing this story set in the Midwest and I did think very specifically also about this moment that did happen where there was this sort of African intellectuals were being brought into the U.S. at that particular time, and they were obviously like Obama's parents. They met, so that part was happening, and I don't know if that would have happened so easily if I wasn't outside of the U.S. because I was constantly looking at it from a great distance. I didn't actually come back to the States that often for the first few years that I was there, so my sense of what was happening in America felt kind of fable-like to some degree. I was like, I didn't have a sort of tactile daily access to it in the same way. And as for the DC novel, I don't know. I have this weird pattern where I seem to work my way through my different parts of my life in different stages. So the first novel was set in DC, where I went to college and where I now teach and where I have lots of family. And then my next novel took place in New York, and this novel actually parts of it end in the Midwest and in Chicago, where I also grew up. So somehow I find ways of bringing back different facets of my life into my story. But even that version of Logan's Circle inside of the novel, it does have, like you can sort of walk your way a piece reading the novel, but it's also very much like not Logan's Circle too, because I wrote it without ever coming back to DC. I wrote it entirely from New York and didn't go back to Logan's Circle until the novel had been finished, because eventually at some point in time the Logan's Circle of my imagination supplanted the Logan's Circle of the real world. And I realized, I knew that, these streets can never look this way, that there was no store on that particular corner, but it all at some point in time became real in my head, and I didn't want to actually intrude. I didn't want reality to intrude on that fictional version. So, yeah. I'm sorry?
It seemed awfully real.
Yes, well, thank you.
So you write...
I think you have to get out.
If I speak loud...
That work? Yeah, okay, I'll repeat the question. No, it's fine, I can repeat the question. Yeah, I'm sorry. Now's your chance to elaborate on it and make it really good.
No, it's just, you write fiction. You write wonderful fiction on a very serious set of subjects relating to immigration. You must have views about the current immigration situation. I just wondered what words of wisdom you have, or what thoughts you would be willing to share about the situation you see happening in the States right now.
Well, which situation there? Because we have both a sort of like aggressive deportation policies of our president, and then we also have a possible immigration bill that exists as an idea maybe in the Senate, but what's more frustrating, of course, is that we have the sort of other half of our government which seems obviously bitterly opposed to doing this, and it's without going into some sort of long political rhetoric about it. Obviously, the simple answer is like we need sort of immigration reform, and we need to just not treat people as if somehow that they are the invaders into our country, right? Like every study has sort of shown that immigration is always a sort of a net benefit to the economy of most countries. Like we're not losing or taking things away. And people have this, who's the argument recently where somebody saying, well, we have X percentage of unemployed Americans, and now the Obama administration wants to make it easier for companies to hire foreign workers. And just like, well, you've just taken two completely different ideas and thrown them together and somehow are trying to create a causal argument between them, that somehow we have increased unemployment and now therefore as a result we're being immigration is the threat to that unemployment, when in fact that's not the case. These aren't logical connections. They're not logical arguments. At the same time, I'd say that Americans' immigration problem to me is much less severe than what I see happening outside of here. Like our problems are things that are sort of persistent and long running, and they have a lot to do with sort of our borders to Mexico, but they don't come under the sort of level of fear that I see across the rest of the world. Like when I look at the rest of the world and I see the problems of migration, which are the same echoing across Europe and across the developed and Western world, those are problems of people feeling like they're losing their country, like their values are under threat. Those are existential crises of nations and states that are really frightening, because then you have much more visceral, much more violent, much more radical, like right-wing responses to those threats. I don't feel the same anxiety here in America. I think here in America we tend to suffer from a lack of policy and a lack of imagination from one part of our government. But it doesn't feel like we really genuinely feel like we are in danger of losing our country, that our country is somehow really pervasively under attack because of illegal immigration. Maybe people along the border fronts feel that way, and there is a drastic divide between the way we feel about it here on the East Coast and the way someone's going to feel about it in Texas and New Mexico. It's not even the same conversation by and large, I think. But on a sort of like national collective level, you know, as much progress as we have to do, I still feel like we'll get there, and we'll get there without the same level of damage that other countries are doing to themselves.
I loved your first two books, and I can't wait to read this one. I appreciate that you don't want to be put into a category of writers who write about the immigrant experience. However, yeah. I wonder if there are some authors who have dealt with these themes that you particularly like. Yeah. I wonder, for example, if you know Ava Hoffman's Lost in Translation and some others that I can think of.
I don't know Ava Hoffman's book. I know of it, but I've never had a pleasure of reading it. And it's not because I'm opposed to the idea that I write about immigrants. My frustration isn't that at all. That is what I write about. My characters are those things. My frustration is with the sort of that being a category of literature, right? That we sort of, there's this wonderful interview with Philip Roth where the first thing he says in one of the rare interviews that he said, I am not a Jewish writer. Right. He's like, I don't write in Hebrew, I don't write in Yiddish, I write in English, I write in America. My characters are Jewish oftentimes, but that is not the total of their experience, right? Like, you want to sort of define somebody purely along those traits, then you lose kind of what the intent of an author is, right? It's not to write about the Jewish experience and even when you say the idea of the immigrant experience, like what is that? Right. Like God, like the immigrant experience if you're coming from Nigeria is going to be really different than if you're coming from Mexico. You know, they're not. There's no normative experience under that blanket. You might as well, you know, it's like the difference between a children's story and a poem, really. There's no universal theme holding those things together. But at the same time, stories that I do love, Chang Gray Lee, I think, is a great sort of writer, and Native Speaker is one of my favorite books that deal with that. A story that I really loved with this novel which kind of has the sort of same immigrant themes, but touches more on the Europe-African relationship, is Season of Migration to the North by Tayeb Salah, which is a Sudanese writer, which goes back and forth. It is very much the sort of discourse about what happens when you sort of go abroad and you become the other, when you have to come back home having been educated in the West and you want to return back to where you came from.
Thanks.
Hey. So both in this book and in Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears, you write about the romantic relationship between a white woman and an African immigrant. So why have you chosen, I guess, to focus on that relationship in particular, and how is that? What was your motivation?
In that case, because it's one of the strongest ways of showing the race divides in our country, right? So if you put people through the microcosm of intimacy, you magnify all the frustrated ways in which our nation's divided. So like how to read the narrator's in a relationship with an African American woman, and that's his wife. And there, in that case, you can actually see the frustrations and divisions that happen between those experiences that are different, right? So the black experience, everyone has that experience of what it means to be black in America, but the narratives are very different, right? When you come here as an immigrant and when you come here as an African American and you are a part of this country's history, you have very different experiences of what it means to grow up. And even within the Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears, that relationship it's fraught by race, but it's really fraught by class in much more ways. So like Judith and Seifa's relationship, the greatest divide that happens between them is, for me, a class one than it is a racial one. I mean, the race and class are always sort of deeply intertwined, and it's hard to separate them. But it really happens. What happens when this person comes into this community, and how are those two able or not able to merge across those lines? In this particular case, because I'm also looking at like 1970s, is it's explicitly about the divisions that come with race, and what happens when. And there's another, putting those two together in a small town in the Midwest and seeing how they come under those pressures, to me was like one of the only ways to really show that how those divisions really tear people apart.
I loved Season of Migration to the North. Phenomenal.
Okay.
And I think the literature coming from that part of Africa is amazing. And your ancestry is Ethiopia.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if, just in the time you've spent in Africa, and I imagine you have, if there are other parts of the continent that you feel maybe inspired by more,
Yeah.
or drawn to talk about more than Ethiopia.
Yeah.
And also the MacArthur Grant. I don't know if you would care to talk about what you did with it, how you spent it, where you went.
There's a very nice car parked outside with a monkey chauffeur. I do feel deeply drawn across the continent. Being born in Ethiopia means that I have a specific attachment to the sort of history and culture of that place, definitely. But it also means that my curiosity about what happens in Africa is expanded upon, perhaps inevitably or by choice, definitely. So a lot of the work that I've done as a journalist has always been specifically around conflict areas in Africa, between Sudan and Uganda and now Eastern Congo. And so I tend to resist terms like Pan-Africanism, because that just, like, Africa's 54 countries, it doesn't really make sense to try to get your mind around that to some degree. But I would say that my engagement with the continent is more than just Ethiopia. It is very much about the sort of like phenomenons that happen across a larger space in African history. So I do feel like it's important not to try to figure out if you can lump them all together. Like, I've never been to West Africa. I don't know it that intimately. It would be very hard for me to write about it. But in terms of the places that I've experienced and have spent time in as a journalist, they have all worked their way into my fiction at some point. There are parts of my second novel that did take place in Sudan. Like I said, this novel is set in Uganda. But really I'm borrowing on images from both Uganda and Congo and Sudan at the same time. And I'm using characters who are, like the narrator in this novel comes from Ethiopia, but also there's sort of a coterie of African young aspiring revolutionaries who come from all over the continent, who are sort of drawn to this place because of its politics, because of the intellectual capital that's taking place there at that time. So I would say, yeah, I'd say my interest begins with Ethiopia and then has expanded outward from there, and probably feels like it will continue to do so. And as for the MacArthur, that's just time to keep working and doing what I do. I mean, the more than anything, it's really that it's like a little flashlight that somebody pulls out and says, this is something interesting, and what you do isn't on the margins. If you ever thought it was, like, it's actually, people care about it, and even if they don't care about it, it's okay. You can keep doing it for at least a few more years. So it's good that some of you care about it, but if you don't, I'll be okay for a little bit. We have time for one more question if there's.
It's kind of a broad question, but I'm curious from your perspective as someone who's been here a long time and been in and out of the country a bunch of times. How do you think American society is doing with dealing with the racial issues that have been such a part of us for so long? Are we stuck? Are we making progress? What do you think?
It's one of those things if you look at it just in the context of America, you think, great, you make a few steps forward, and then you also have to recognize that there's radical steps being made backwards. You say, well, we have a president, obviously, and that's oftentimes the common narrative. And then at the same time, you can see that it's a pretty amazing thing that we have this president. It's hard to sometimes forget that, and how we feel about him now is still secondary to the fact that he is there and he exists, and whatever his policies may be. Nonetheless, we did get him there. Like, this country somehow managed to do that. That's a pretty crazy thing, like that we went from 1963 You know, to have that civil rights movement, to have that happen now, that's a remarkable feat. And at the same time, you see all the sort of responses that happen against that reaction, right? So you're reminded of anything that the narrative is not finished just because we got him there. And so that becomes the danger. You think, well, we managed to get this far, that means everything is resolved. When you can also look at it and say, well, we managed to do this, that means we have a capacity to do a hell of a lot better, right? That there is this sort of still malingering problem, and if anything, that problem might find itself more deeply entrenched. So it may grow smaller, it may seem more marginal, but it can also root itself more deeply into certain communities, and can also serve as a way of sort of fracturing and dividing our country. And at the same time, I say that, and it's looking at the rest of the world, and someone who spent time outside of this country, I've come to appreciate the extremity of what's happened here by large. I look at the Western Europe and the world that happens outside of there. They are just a generation away from being able to do what we've been able to do, and they've never even had the same complicated racial legacy and history that this country has had. So I mean, and you could counter that by also saying, well, African Americans they're Americans. They should have been there a long time ago, right? There should have been somebody in the White House 2 generations ago. But excluding all that, I would be surprised, amazed if I see a minority president anywhere in Europe in my lifetime. It would be stunning to me. I don't see it happen. I mean, it could happen. Who knows? Things change really quickly, but not the way we do here. So our capacity to evolve is our sort of greatest kind of gift in this country, right? So we fail many times. We fail historically, but we move, which is a pretty good thing. And I tend to take some faith in that.